The sound of breaking glass echoed through the marble hallway. A man's voice, sharp, angry, dangerous, followed. "Are you out of your mind?" It was Jonathan Blake, a 35-year-old white millionaire, dressed in a crisp tailored suit. His face was flushed with fury as he towered over a trembling young boy, a black delivery boy, no older than 16. The boy's hands shook as he clutched a brown paper bag, food spilling onto the polished floor. "I was just trying to deliver. Sir, please," the boy stammered, eyes darting toward the heavy gold-framed clock on the wall. But Jonathan didn't care. With a sneer, he shoved the boy backward. "Late. 10 minutes late. Do you have any idea who I am? People like you should learn to work faster." The boy stumbled, nearly falling, his eyes wide with humiliation. And then silence, because in the corner of the room, watching it all, was a little girl. A pale-faced, blue-eyed child of 5, clutching a stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles turned white. This was Jonathan's daughter, Clara. She hadn't spoken a word in her entire life. Doctors called it selective mutism. Jonathan called it weakness. But tonight, something stirred in her. Her wide eyes filled with tears as she looked at the boy. Her lips trembled. And then, just faintly, she hummed. A melody soft and broken, but a melody all the same. And beside her stood the nanny, Grace, a 30-year-old black woman with warmth in her eyes. Grace's voice joined the little girl's, steady and strong. A song of comfort. A song of defiance. Jonathan froze, rage boiling inside him. His own daughter, his mute daughter, had chosen to sing not to him, but with the nanny and a poor black delivery boy. And what happened after that moment would change every life in that mansion. If you believe no child should ever suffer this way, hit subscribe and like this video now, because this story will shake your heart. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. Grace Daniels had been working in the Blake household for nearly a year now. At 30, she carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that only comes from weathering storms most people never even see. Her skin was deep and radiant, her hair tied neatly back, and her smile, when she dared to show it, was enough to make any child feel safe. She had not come from wealth. Grace's life was stitched together with long shifts, secondhand clothes, and prayers whispered in the dark. She worked to support her younger siblings, still in school, and to cover the medical bills of her aging mother. But when she walked into that towering glass mansion each morning, she carried none of that burden in her eyes. She carried light. And that light had touched little Clara Blake. Clara was a delicate child, pale skin, soft blonde curls, and eyes that seemed always to be searching for something just beyond her reach. At 5 years old, she had never spoken a single word. Doctors had explained it clinically, labeling her with conditions and prescribing endless therapies. But Grace, from the very first day, had seen something else. She saw fear. Not silence born of illness, but silence born of shadows. Jonathan Blake was a man of enormous wealth, yes. His business empire stretched across cities, and his name opened doors wherever he went. But to his daughter, he was a storm. His temper crackled like lightning. His punishments fell like thunder. Clara never knew when his voice might rise, when his hand might slam against a table, when his eyes might turn cold and hard. Grace had seen it, seen how Clara flinched at the sound of her father's footsteps, how her little hands tightened on her stuffed rabbit whenever his car pulled into the driveway. Yet with Grace, Clara changed. The girl would reach out for her nanny's hand. She would follow her voice. She would listen when Grace sang lullabies or whispered bedtime stories about hope and courage. Sometimes, late at night, Grace would hear a soft humming from Clara's room, like the girl's heart was trying to break through the walls her mind had built. It wasn't speech. Not yet, but it was something. Jonathan, however, noticed none of this. To him, Grace was just the help. He paid her well, but his respect ended with the money he transferred to her bank account. He dismissed her insights about Clara, silenced her suggestions, and often ignored her presence altogether. When business partners came over, he didn't even acknowledge her standing in the corner, holding Clara's hand. And yet, in the quiet spaces Jonathan never entered, Grace and Clara built a world of their own. A world of whispered songs, of storybooks brought to life, of trust that grew day by day. Still, Grace knew her place. She knew her job depended on silence, her silence. She couldn't challenge Jonathan, couldn't contradict him, couldn't reveal the bruises his words left on Clara's heart. She had seen what happened to staff who dared to speak too boldly. They disappeared overnight, replaced without a second thought. And so she endured. But deep down, Grace prayed. She prayed that one day Clara's voice would come. That one day the little girl would break free of her father's shadow. What Grace didn't know was that the breaking point was closer than anyone imagined. Because Jonathan's cruelty was not limited to his daughter. It spilled into every corner of his life, into the way he spoke to waiters, to drivers, to delivery boys. His wealth had made him believe he was untouchable. And as Clara watched in silence and Grace clenched her fists quietly by her side, Jonathan was about to take his arrogance too far. But this was only the beginning. The first storm came quietly. It was a Tuesday morning, sunlight spilling across the marble floors. Grace was buttoning Clara's little sweater, humming softly, when Jonathan's voice thundered from the dining hall. "Grace, where's the orange juice?" Grace hurried in, Clara clinging shyly to her hand. The millionaire sat at the end of a long mahogany table, breakfast spread out like a feast before him. But his glass was empty. "I'm sorry, sir," Grace said softly. "The store delivery hasn't come yet." Jonathan cut her off with a scoff. "Excuses. Always excuses. Do you people ever learn to be on time?" Clara flinched at the sharpness in his tone. Grace instinctively squeezed her tiny hand, steadying her. But Jonathan noticed the gesture, and his eyes narrowed. "She's 5 years old, Grace. Still hasn't spoken. Still hiding behind you. And you expect me to believe you're helping her." His voice dripped with contempt. "You're nothing more than a glorified babysitter. I pay you to keep her alive. Don't pretend you're some miracle worker." Grace lowered her eyes, biting back her words. Inside, though, her heart burned. She wanted to say, "She's humming because of me. She's reaching out because of me. She's alive inside because of me." But she said nothing. Clara's small chest rose and fell rapidly, her blue eyes darting between her father's face and Grace's silence. And for the first time, she pressed her cheek against Grace's arm, hiding from him. Jonathan noticed, and it cut him like a knife. But instead of softening, it hardened him. And what came next was even worse. Jonathan had invited business associates over. Men in suits, women in glittering dresses, all sipping wine and laughing as though the world was theirs. The Blake mansion buzzed with music, clinking glasses, and shallow compliments. Clara sat quietly on the staircase, clutching her stuffed rabbit, while Grace stood nearby to watch her. And that's when it happened. One of the women, noticing the little girl, leaned toward Jonathan with a curious smile. "She's beautiful, Jonathan. So delicate. Does she ever sing for you?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. A dark shadow crossed his face. He forced a laugh, but his eyes burned. "She doesn't speak," he said flatly. "Hasn't spoken a word. Useless little condition the doctors can't fix." He took a sip of his drink, then added cruelly, "What good is a daughter who can't even say her father's name?" A hush fell over the group. Nervous chuckles followed, the kind people used to smooth over discomfort. But Clara heard every word. Her little hands trembled against her rabbit's fur. Grace's chest tightened. She wanted to scoop the girl up, shield her from the cruelty. But she couldn't, not here, not now. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward her, daring her to intervene. So she stood frozen, silent, tears burning in her throat. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she buried her face into Grace's chest and hummed again, soft, broken notes that spoke of pain she couldn't voice. Grace stroked her hair and whispered, "One day, sweetheart, one day, your voice will shine." But Jonathan was not done. And the worst storm was yet to come. It was late evening when the delivery boy arrived, a lanky black teenager with sweat on his brow, balancing bags of groceries in his arms. His name was Malik, and he was working 2 jobs after school to help his mother pay rent. Traffic had been heavy. He was 10 minutes late. Jonathan was waiting. The moment Malik stepped through the door, Jonathan's anger erupted. "Late? Do you idiots not own clocks?" Malik stammered. "I am sorry, sir. There was an accident on the highway. Don't you dare talk back to me." Jonathan roared, snatching the bag from his hands and hurling it against the wall. Glass jars shattered, juice ran across the marble. Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her tiny fingers. Then Jonathan did the unthinkable. He shoved Malik against the doorframe, his voice seething with venom. "People like you are born lazy. 10 minutes late to me is $10,000 in lost business. Do you understand that?" Malik's chest heaved. His dark eyes filled with humiliation, but also something else. Strength. He didn't reply. He simply stood, swallowing his pain. And in the silence, a sound. A hum. Grace turned sharply. Clara, sweet, trembling Clara, was standing in the corner, humming louder than she ever had before. Her little face was wet with tears, but her voice, though shaky, rose like a fragile bird breaking free. Grace dropped to her knees beside her, joining in, her warm alto wrapping around Clara's fragile melody. A lullaby, simple and pure. Malik stared in awe. Jonathan froze, his fury momentarily stunned by the impossible. His mute daughter was singing. But his shock twisted quickly to rage. No, he hissed. Not with her. Not with the nanny. Not with some delivery boy watching. He stormed forward, ripping the stuffed rabbit from Clara's arms and throwing it to the ground. The child wailed, not in words but in sound, a desperate cry that shook the air. Enough of this nonsense, Jonathan shouted. You'll sing for me, or you'll sing for no one. Grace shielded Clara with her arms, her own tears streaming freely now. Malik, fists clenched, stood rooted at the door, torn between fear and fury. The mansion was thick with silence, except for the sobs of a little girl whose voice had just begun to bloom. And what came next would change everything. That was the breaking point. Jonathan's arrogance had crossed a line too sharp to return from. Grace's patience had snapped. Malik's quiet endurance had turned to defiance. And Clara had tasted the power of her own voice, however fragile it was. The storm was ready to turn. And karma was already at the door. Jonathan's face was red with fury, veins pulsing at his temple as he towered over his daughter. Clara's cries echoed through the marble hall, her little hands reaching desperately for the rabbit he had thrown. Grace tightened her arms around the girl, whispering, "It's okay, baby. I've got you. I won't let anyone hurt you." But Jonathan sneered. "You dare defy me in my own house?" His voice cracked like a whip. "I pay you, Grace. Don't ever forget your place." Then, without warning, he shoved her shoulder. Grace stumbled but didn't release Clara. She planted her feet firmly and glared at him with tear-filled eyes. For the first time, she didn't bow her head. And Malik couldn't stay silent anymore. "Stop it," the boy shouted, his voice trembling but strong. "You're scaring her. She's just a kid." Jonathan spun on him, eyes blazing. "You don't tell me how to raise my daughter." But before he could unleash another torrent of insults, another sound filled the room. A voice. Tiny, trembling, but clear. "Daddy, stop." Jonathan froze. His breath caught in his throat. His eyes whipped down to Clara, his mute daughter, who now stood clutching Grace's sweater, her lips parted, her voice quivering but undeniable. The room fell utterly silent. Even Malik gasped. Grace's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled over. She had spoken. For the first time in her life, Clara had spoken. But it wasn't for him. It wasn't to please him. It was to defy him. "Daddy, don't hurt her," Clara whispered, her little voice shaking but steadying with each word. "Don't hurt Grace." The words struck like thunder. Jonathan stumbled back a step, as though the weight of them had physically hit him. His daughter's first words, and they weren't love. They weren't daddy. They were a plea for him to stop. Grace's knees buckled as she held Clara tighter, sobbing with joy and heartbreak. Malik's fists unclenched, awe spreading across his face. Jonathan tried to recover, forcing a bitter laugh. You see? She spoke because of me. Because of my discipline." But just then the front doors swung wide. Two of Jonathan's business associates, those who had left the party early, stepped inside, their voices loud as they entered. "Jonathan, we forgot our coats." They froze. They saw the shattered groceries on the floor. They saw Malik with bruised arms. They saw Grace shielding Clara, the little girl's face streaked with tears. And they saw Jonathan, towering enraged, caught mid-rant. And then, like a dagger, they heard Clara's trembling voice again. "Please don't hurt us." The men's expressions hardened. One of them pulled out his phone. "Jonathan, what on earth are you doing?" In that moment, the empire he had built on intimidation began to crack. His associates, powerful men with reputations to protect, now saw him not as a strong leader, but as a monster bullying a child, a nanny, and a teenage boy. Jonathan's face drained of color. He sputtered excuses, pointing at Grace, at Malik, claiming they were ungrateful, incompetent. But no one listened, because Clara's voice, fragile, pure, undeniable, rang louder than all his excuses. The delivery boy, Malik, finally stepped forward, his voice firm. "You'll never scare her again." And Grace, rising to her feet, added softly but fiercely, "Her silence is broken, Mr. Blake. And so is your power." Jonathan's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, the man who silenced others stood utterly silenced himself. And in that silence, karma had spoken. What happened after that would change everything forever. The house was no longer filled with Jonathan Blake's thunderous voice. It was filled with silence, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed, when broken branches still tremble on the ground. The two business associates who had walked in on the scene didn't waste a moment. One called security, the other called child services. Within an hour, uniformed officers were at the Blake mansion, asking questions Jonathan had no convincing answers for. Malik, though shaken, told his side. Grace spoke through tears, her voice steady and protective. And Clara, fragile but brave, confirmed it all with the handful of words she had just discovered. Jonathan tried to bluster. He ranted about respect, about discipline, about his house, his rules. But every word only sank him deeper. The men who once admired him now looked at him with disgust. The empire he'd built on arrogance and intimidation began to crumble. Not because of a business rival, not because of financial loss, but because of the truth revealed inside his own home. By morning, the news had spread through his circle. Investors pulled out, his company's board demanded answers, and whispers of abuse began to ripple across the city. For the first time, Jonathan Blake was forced to look in the mirror and see not a millionaire, not a leader, but a man stripped bare of respect. And Grace? She stood taller than ever. She remained by Clara's side through the interviews, through the tears, through the trembling hands. When officers asked the little girl who she wanted to stay with, Clara pointed firmly to Grace. The court later made it official. Jonathan would undergo investigation and therapy, while Clara's care would remain with Grace until decisions were finalized. In the meantime, the mansion that once felt like a prison began to echo with something it had never held before: hope. Malik, too, found justice. The story of the delivery boy who stood up to a millionaire spread quickly, and people in the community rallied behind him. Donations poured in to support his education and his family. He was no longer just a late delivery boy. He was a symbol of courage. But the greatest change was Clara. Every day after that night, she grew stronger. Her first words had been born out of fear, but soon they blossomed into laughter, songs, and bedtime whispers with Grace. She began to hum without trembling, to sing without tears. And one evening, as the sun set beyond the mansion's glass walls, she looked up at Grace and whispered something that made the nanny's heart break and heal all at once. "Thank you for listening to me before anyone else did." Grace wept, holding her close. The storm had passed. The silence was broken. And the little girl who had once been voiceless now had a song that could never be silenced again. No amount of wealth or power can silence the truth forever. Cruelty may roar, but even the smallest, trembling voice, once it rises, can shake the walls of injustice. If you believe every child deserves to be heard, and every act of cruelty deserves its karma, then share this story. And if you want more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like, because together we can give a voice to those the world tries to silence.